Okay, let's get underway. For those who don't know me, I'm Gary Mond. I'm chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. And welcome to this meeting with Christian Wakeford, who is the Labour Member of Parliament for Bury South. Christian was elected to Parliament in December 2019 as a Conservative MP. In January 2022, he then crossed the floor, so to speak, and joined the Labour Party. And then he served as PP as a parliamentary private secretary to Bridget Phillipson, who was the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. He's then served as an opposition whip, and he's become very well known, particularly this year, and I think under the gratitude of a lot of people in the Jewish community, for raising the issue of Roger Waters' concerts in question to Penny Mordaunt, Leader of the House. I was quite surprised that very few others really raised the issue as much as Christian did, which was impressive. Prior to being in Parliament, he was very heavily involved in local government for many years on Lancashire County Council and Pendle Borough Council. So what's going to happen is I'm going to ask Christian some questions, and he's going to answer, and then we'll throw it open. Before I do, I'd like to make a special welcome. I see Dennis Ruth, our honorary president, is here with us tonight. Ruth, it's great to see you, and I hope you're keeping well. Okay, so let me kick off with the first question. Christian, why did you get involved in politics in the first place? It's a rough and tumble activity, isn't it? What attracted you to politics?
Thanks, Gary. And I'll start actually by wishing everyone a slightly belated Shana Tova. But how did I get into politics? I was actually doing a podcast for the Fed last year, and I was described as the accidental MP. Not because I was elected accidentally, but my route into politics was slightly unorthodox. And it started at college. I chose my A-levels, and I quite academic, so I was doing maths, further maths, chemistry, business studies, and physics, and I wasn't enjoying the physics. So I had a friend who was doing politics, and he said, "Well, why don't you do this?" So I chose politics as an A-level instead of physics, mainly so I could have a friend to go to the pub at lunchtime with. And that's a true story. It just turned out that I actually really enjoyed politics. So for A-level politics, it was very much basic political philosophy as to the sociology behind political parties, what they stood for, etc. And I got more and more fascinated, kind of looked into my upbringing and what I thought was my political identity at the time. It wasn't even my best result at A-level, but it's the one I enjoyed the most. So I studied it for my first degree at Lancaster University, where I got more involved in party politics, having joined, like I said, the Conservative Party and Conservative Future at the time, now known as Young Conservatives, and just got more and more involved until I then was elected to Lancashire County Council in 2013 and Pendle Borough Council in 2015. And I guess at that point, it was one of those where you're pretty much enacting over people's laws and decisions, and in local government, it was pretty much what cuts are we making, or what cuts are we avoiding making this year just to have to do it next year. And I realized that's not really what I came into politics for, as cliche as it is, and anyone who knows me knows I hate cliches. People come into politics to help people. So for me, it was very much a case of, well, actually, the only way to help people is to be one of those people making the laws rather than just trying to enact it in a decision which is only mitigating the inevitable. So I decided to stand for Parliament. And in the July of 2019, I was selected for the seat of Bury South, where I'm still the Member of Parliament now, and was fortunate enough to be selected. I call home, and it was a interesting campaign for one of the most Jewish seats outside of London, for what was a incredibly troubled time, and I say that with at the time, probably understanding it was difficult, but not realizing how bad it was until probably the Jewish hustings at the Shrubberies in Prestwich, where I stood up and said, "I'm Christian, you're Conservative Party candidate," and got a standing ovation. But it was the morning after the election that will kind of haunt me, but stay with me for the rest of my life. And it was a Orthodox Jewish lady came up to me as I was buying a coffee, and she basically thanked me because they were able to unpack their bags that morning. So I knew things were bad for the community. I hadn't realized it was leave the country bad. So that's something that would stay with me. And from that point on, I thought, well, from my perspective, the Jewish community, certainly in modern history, others would argue for most of history, has been one of, if not the most ostracized. Now, my name's Christian. I'm clearly not Jewish, but I want to be a supporter and a friend of the community to show that actually you don't have to be to be speaking in favor. You don't have to be Jewish to take a strong stance on issues of anti-Semitism, of Shahita, or anything else. You just have to be tolerant, understanding, and friendly. So I jumped in with both feet, and some would say that's a good thing, some would say that's a bad thing. To learn more and more about Jewish culture, where I came from in Pendle, the local ethnic minority group was Pakistani, Asian, South Asian heritage. So I wanted to learn more and more, to the point I even started learning Hebrew, atrociously. Wow. For anyone who says my go-to phrase is still "Ani lo melvin ifrit." So those who don't speak Hebrew, I don't understand Hebrew.
Thank you.
So I got more and more involved, and I guess that's why I went into politics, to help people. And it's coming on to your next question, it's not been the easiest of paths, but still here.
Those are very laudable objectives. Thank you. My next question is one I'm sure lots of people will be wondering, is why you crossed the floor in January 2022 from Conservative to Labour?
So I think part of it goes back to why I got involved in politics in the first place, which was to ultimately try to help people. And shortly after being elected, I'm making my maiden speech, and I remember one comment of saying, well, I was an insurance broker by trade, so I was already hated, so why not become a member of parliament, because they're really popular. FYI, they're not. But I steadfastly believed it's my job to be there to help people find the way through difficult times, but offer support. 4 months after being elected, we went into a global lockdown, and we had the COVID pandemic, to the point I couldn't even vote on the COVID legislation because I had COVID. And I think we got to, I think it was the very first free school meal debate, the argument that was certainly put forward by Marcus Rashford and the likes. And I was essentially threatened by the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, at the time. And it was, you either back the government on this, which was not to basically feed hungry children during a pandemic, during school holidays, or this school you're wanting for your constituency, you won't get it. So it was, how do you choose between social mobility for a town of 30,000 people without a high school, or feeding hungry children? There is no good answer to this question, and it kind of felt like a we the bad guys moment, and it certainly didn't sit comfortably with me. So I couldn't back the government on that one. So I abstained, which was kind of as close to going against it as I could, without kind of sticking two fingers up to everyone, and certainly making sure we weren't getting the school. So that kind of started asking questions. We then got to the International Trade Bill with the Genocide Amendment. Obviously, with my constituency, I don't want any of us to trade with genocidal regimes, certainly when we're speaking of China and Xinjiang, certainly Iran as well. So I rebelled on that one, because I thought the government were absolutely in the wrong position. But then I think we started seeing a difference in politics. It was becoming very defensive, and whether it was trying to stick up for Dominic Cummings, who I fundamentally believe was in the wrong, put out a statement to say so, to then into sleaze with Owen Paterson and Partygate. That's not what I came into politics for. And I remember my last ever Conservative Party conference where I got what I can only diplomatically describe as a bollocking, because I said they were failing a generation of young people. And I stood by it then, I stand by it now, because of the COVID recovery and education and children not being in school. So it was at that point where the Labour Party reached out to me, basically saying, we're liking everything you're saying, do you want to chat? So it probably took about a month of a lot of shadow ministers approaching me and wanting a chat before I sat down with them. Obviously, I had a broken ankle at the time. Seemed to have a thing about injuring my leg. So it's dragged on for a bit of meetings off the estate with the whips, and the week of crossing the floor, I sat down with Keir Starmer. It was an hour and a half meeting, of which 45 minutes of that was just about anti-Semitism, because obviously for my constituency, for the work I'd done with the community at that point, I wanted to know where he was going, what his plan was, and what it meant. And ultimately, if I didn't agree with Keir, if I didn't believe Keir, I wouldn't be sat here right now. So we had a very in-depth conversation, and I agreed with what he was saying, especially when it came to tackling it, rooting it out of the party, and fundamentally having no safe space for anti-Semitism, because there is no safe space for anti-Semitism. But to go further, because to me, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's two sides of the same coin. So he really impressed me with that, and certainly going into the cost of living crisis, so actually being the only party speaking about it at that time. And for anyone who knows my constituency, yes, there's huge areas of affluence, but there are huge areas of deprivation, food banks and everything. So I wanted to make sure we were doing everything we could do going into that cost of living crisis that we're still in now, to help my constituents. And I didn't think the government could do that, which is ultimately why on that day, on the 19th of January 2022, I joined a small club of what is now 5 people who crossed the floor from Conservatives to Labour.
Thank you very much. I want to move on now to an issue which has earned you the gratitude of a lot of people in the Jewish community in the UK, which was the fact that you spoke out about Roger Waters' concerts, and that you were quite definitive in your condemnation and in your question to Penny Mordaunt, the Leader of the House. What puzzled me at the time was, I was delighted with what you said. What puzzled me is I didn't get the impression that you had as much support as you should have had from either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party in what you were doing. And I just wanted your comments on, firstly, why you did what you did, which is great that you did, by the way, but why? And what I mean, we don't know because we're not in the House of Commons, but what sort of support or lack of support were you getting from other members of Parliament of any political party for that
matter? So in short, why did I do it? Like I say, it goes back to my answer to the first question of trying to throw myself into the community to understand it more, and realizing just how hard things have been, certainly since 2015, I would say longer as well. And ultimately, I think the community needs friends. So I was very fortunate to go and speak in Tel Aviv on the invite of Yair Lapid at the 7th Global Forum on combating anti-Semitism. And to be fair, I've never felt so inadequate. You had what I can only describe as the rock star of combating anti-Semitism of Deborah Lipstadt opening, and then world leaders, senior diplomats, and then me, a backbench MP from the north of England. So it was slightly out of my comfort zone. And when people were saying, we've only got 10 minutes, what can you say? I'm a backbench MP. I normally only get 3 minutes, so I'm either going to speak really slowly or repeat myself. But I think the fact that I wasn't Jewish, and to quote the audience, had no skin in the game, made it quite powerful that there is representation out there. When we saw the month of hate and the convoys travelling down from Bradford to Finchley, saying awful things, which I'm not going to repeat because we all know the stories. The tropes of anti-Semitism going through the streets of London, but across the globe. We need to say no, not in my name, not anywhere, because racism is racism, and anti-Semitism is racism. We need to call it out. I think there's a lot of people who have stated that actually we should probably change the name of anti-Semitism to anti-Jewish hatred, because that's what it is.
Yes.
So when I saw the images of Roger Waters, both current and historic, I had to call it out. Granted, the pig had been updated, but when it's previously had the Star of David on, when it's now got I think it's the IDF symbol on there, when you're calling out Anne Frank whilst wearing a black SS style uniform and firing a pretend machine gun into the audience. No, just it's simple. You have to say no to this, otherwise, people do agree. People are impressionable, and the next thing we know, we have another month of hate and more marches, and that's ignoring some of the issues that are going on in the Middle East at the moment. So I called it out in the chamber for what I saw as blatant anti-Semitism in my view. And I was surprised when you say there wasn't support. When I was leaving the chamber, I did have Penny Mordaunt come up to me, as I also had Fangham Debonair and the SNP, just saying, we didn't know this was going on. It's absolutely atrocious. So it was heartening to see a few more colleagues coming out. I think we had Andy Burnham, Keir Starmer came out speaking against it in the end, as did Sadiq Khan. Because I stand by it. There is no place for shows like that, in modern society. If he wanted to just have a show of his music, that's a different thing. But do I think he's going to do it? No. And what did I get on the back of it? Other than thousands of anti-Semitic tropes against me? And I'm not Jewish. You say what you want about me, but I'm standing up for what I believe in, and it was the right thing to do. So the fact he recorded a 20-minute interview calling me out. He's called me out on stage, I think, in Frankfurt, Birmingham, London, and Manchester. Called me a cripple, which was ironic because I was actually on crutches at the time. But then basically, and I think this is how it summed it up, basically said I was doing it on behalf of my masters in the Foreign Office of Tel Aviv. So if you were trying to say it was satire or I was calling out X, Y, Z, I'm sorry, but you've summed up your anti-Semitism in a trope clearly covered by the IRA definition against me. In my opinion, he's an old racist crank. He had his time. For all those who were saying, "Oh, but it's the wall, it's satire, it's theatre," just because it was made in 1973 doesn't mean it's right now. We're 2023. We need to get with the times, and I would say it wasn't appropriate then. It's not appropriate now. We need to call it out and stamp it out of society, whether that's the arts, sport, or politics.
And then just following on this, what are your hopes for the future with regard to, quote, stamping it out? Is there anything that Parliament can do more than it's doing already?
I think it's a tricky one, because I think we can pass laws. It's ultimately how they're policed and enforced. So, when we've done some of the laws on protests and hate crimes, etc., for all the signs and placards, and whether it was blood libels we saw on the streets of London, there are laws against this already. But if you've got a protest of a couple thousand people and 20, 30, 40 police officers, there's not a lot they can actually do. So I think there's an onus on all politicians, but all people in society, to make people aware that what they're doing isn't to be tolerated. It's not right. And, we're very fortunate we have a platform where hopefully we are listened to, but it's certainly picked up in the press. My fear is, especially in recent years, it became much more acceptable for a lot of these tropes and language to be used, whether it was anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, or just plain right, wrong and vulgar. It was given a platform. There's no longer a valid platform there, but it doesn't mean the journey stopped. You know, do I ever think we're going to reach a destination where anti-Semitism is completely stamped out of society? Unfortunately, no. But I think that means we all have to try that bit harder to make sure we go as far down that journey as we can do. Because you know, when I walk around my Jewish communities in Whitefield and Prestwich, I see arguably the most accepting, friendly, tolerant society. Why aren't we supporting that? And the community's thriving. You know, I hate the term with, you know, we need to wrap our arms around the community because it sounds like you need protected, but you do. It's why you've got the CST. And you know, the number of times I said to them, you know, my job isn't over until you're finished, because I don't want there to be security outside schools or shuls or cemeteries. It's a failure of society that we need this.
I think that's absolutely right. Just to move on now to the issue of the Labour Party and anti-Semitism, I think that it doesn't really matter what political party you vote for. Everybody wants to see the Labour Party rid itself of anti-Semitism. Even right-wing conservatives want that, because we know that we live in this country and there's quite a probability there'll be a Labour government, and we do not want to have to think about leaving the country because the government is run by anti-Semites. I'm sure you get this question a lot, but I want to focus on a point which you probably don't hear so much. I'm not so fussed myself about senior figures, Keir Starmer, and senior figures in the shadow cabinet, or indeed many of the high-profile figures on the parliamentary Labour benches at the moment. I think that the number of core ministers has been massively reduced. The area that worries me, however, is the Labour Party's prospective parliamentary candidates. You see, Labour's got, I think, just over 200 members of parliament at the moment. If the Labour Party does as well in the next election as the opinion pollsters think it will have 400, even 450 members of parliament. So there's 200 to 250 people, new Labour MPs, on whom the torch has not been shone, so to speak. We know very little about these people, although they're well known in their constituencies, I'm sure, but nationally they're not well known. And my concern is some of them might be, maybe quite a number of them might be, of Jeremy Corbyn's political views. After all, some of them were probably selected while he was still leader. So I just want you to give us an update on, firstly, what's happening in the Labour Party with regards to fighting anti-Semitism generally, and secondly, on the specific point I make about prospective parliamentary candidates.
Right. So I think there's quite a few different things there. So where's the party now? I think the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is not a Labour MP sends quite a strong message already. I think the fact that Diane Abbott is not a Labour MP shows that from a whip's perspective, and I can say this as a Labour whip, there is a zero tolerance approach. You know, when someone said something I would say was inappropriate, they got dragged back to the chamber to apologise within half an hour. So there is absolutely a zero tolerance approach from the parliamentary Labour Party. But you mentioned our prospective parliamentary candidates. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a PPC delegation to Israel. I mean, Gary, you'll probably remember some of the delegation, but going around Yad Vashem is life-changing for anyone. So going to meet President Herzog, going to the Paris Center for Peace, going to Kibbutzim, next to the Gaza Strip. This is fundamentally changing for a lot of people, and you know, I've been on these, whether it's Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel. I've been on both, but we are educating people. But when we talk about our PPCs, yes, there's not been a torch shone on them, but there has been a lot of due diligence going through, you know, an entire history of social media. And if there's anything that stood out from any, they've been blocked. They've not got through because we want to send a strong message that we are taking this seriously. We want a level of professionalism, not only in our candidates but in the parliamentary party. And if you let some of the candidates through that we have done previously, I don't think you would do. So there's been former MPs who've been blocked for things they've said, and whether we've seen it in Kensington, in Peterborough, people have been blocked for saying things that I would consider to be anti-Semitic. But we also have many previous MPs who are looking at coming back, and whether it's my neighbour James Frith in Bury North, who was on the delegation with me in February. His wife is Jewish. So for him, the anti-Semitism under Corbyn was quite a personal thing. But we have several moderate members who weren't exactly welcome in the Corbyn Labour Party, who are looking forward to coming back to a centrist, moderate, mainstream, adult conversation. So I think in terms of where is the Labour Party now, I would say it's fundamentally changed. If it hadn't, like I said earlier, I wouldn't be here. I consider myself a moderate centrist. Would I have had this conversation to join Labour under Jeremy Corbyn? Absolutely not. So I think whilst there are some left-wing members still in the PLP, they have not grown up, but they've certainly known that they have to choose their language carefully as well. So I think it's a fundamentally different place. I think it's much more welcoming. The fact that JLM are saying it's a much more tolerant, accepting, welcoming environment sends a strong message. But when we've got Louise Ellman, who I would almost consider the matriarch of Jewish Labour politics, coming back to a party, that sent a strong message. But Luciana, when she actually had to have security going to previous party conferences, that sent an incredibly strong message to a lot of the Jewish community. And I'm going on a delegation to Israel and hopefully Morocco with her in December around the Abraham Accords. So I think the more work we can do with Luciana, the more work we can do to get our moderate Jewish members back in the party, has to be grasped with both hands. And I think they're seeing it, and conversations I'm having, whether it's in Radcliffe, Whitefield, or Prestwich, are showing more and more of the Jewish community essentially open to trusting the party again. And I think from where it was a couple of years ago, that's a strong sign of the direction we're taking.
I think it's good that Labour Friends of Israel have recently had a couple of trips with groups of Labour MPs and PPCs. I think that I would suggest, apart from maybe because I'm a Conservative, but I would suggest that you increase that number of trips, and the more Labour MPs and Labour PPCs you can get to go, the better, and the less of a problem you'll have. This is what's happened to the Conservative parties, that they really, over the last 10 years now, 15 years even, had large numbers of trips of MPs and PPCs to Israel. This can only help the matter.
Gary, if you want to donate to Labour Friends of Israel as well, I'm sure we can get even more delegations going up. We do have more delegations coming up. In fact, I was sat down with Michael Rubin, the director of Labour Friends of Israel, just yesterday. So there's a lot more planned. We are wanting to get more people out, but I think, like you said, whether it's a education piece, and it is educational, certainly just from a geopolitical climate, the more people we get out there to understand it, the less ignorance there is. And I think ignorance is what feeds hatred. And I think if we can address that, education is the long-term solution here.
Good. I want now to move on to the issue of the Labour Party in Israel specifically. What are you finding that the general thoughts within the Labour Parliamentary Party about the situation in Israel? Firstly, the current situation, judicial review, which everyone is talking about, and secondly, the bigger picture as the attitude to Israel from the Labour Party generally, both in terms of its interface with anti-Semitism, and also in terms of any discussions about what they think might be ideal outcomes, like a two-state solution, which is, of course, fairly controversial. But it is widely supported by both the Conservative and Labour parties. So really, if you could give us your views on what the Parliamentary Party is thinking and saying about all matters to do with Israel.
So I think a prime way of describing where the party is at now was Labour Party conference last year, and it was a daunting experience for me because it was my first ever one. But one of the most subscribed receptions I've been to in years of party conferences was Labour Friends of Israel. It got to a point where people had to leave the room because it was getting so hot. It was uncomfortable until people could figure out how to open the windows. But it was incredibly well received. The fact we had not only the Shadow Foreign Secretary of David Lammy, we had Rachel Reeves as Shadow Chancellor there, but we had Keir Starmer there with our sister party from Israel, which I think showed that we are committed to a strong, meaningful relationship moving forward. Those times where I would call them troubled times, they're over. We want to have an adult, meaningful relationship moving forward. We've got the Labour Friends of Israel dinner coming up in November. To a point, it's probably oversubscribed again, but there are parliamentarians on every single table, as you remember from CFI dinners and how subscribed they can get. So I think the fact we've got more and more people wanting to engage sends a very clear message as to where we're at. In regards to the approach to Israel itself, yes, I mean, the party policy, similar to the government, is a two-state solution. I find it difficult to see how that can be delivered at the moment, because to have a two-state solution, you need two people sat around a table and negotiating in peaceful talks. You can't do that when you're firing missiles from Gaza or from the West Bank. So I think adult conversations need to be had in order to find a independent Palestinian state, but a safe, secure, thriving Israel, which, let's face it, is the only democracy in the Middle East, but more importantly, the only Jewish state in the world. So I think there's quite a few stumbling blocks we've got at the moment. Yeah, I think the current government and some of their representatives, and I think Ben Gvir being a prime example, are probably antagonizing that relationship a bit more. So I think that is potentially making it much more difficult. The judicial review elements, and I've seen the protests in London. I've actually joined one of them, but I've seen the protests in Tel Aviv. I've seen the protests in Jerusalem. When we were in Israel in February, speaking to President Herzog, he was highlighting his concerns as to what that would mean. Do I think there's a cause for reform? Possibly, but I think it needs to be quantified reform. You can't just say this is the majority of the Knesset, therefore we're going to do whatever we want. If you could say, well, we've got 66%, 2/3 of the Knesset, there's a strong public will to address this. But I think there's quite a few things we forget about the Knesset. Up until the election, we actually had Arabs serving in the government. So when people say, Israel is a racist endeavor, no, it's not. When you've got Amnesty International saying, Israel is an apartheid state, no, it's not. Now, you can access education, you can access healthcare. You've got Arabs in the government. You've got the freedom to protest. None of this is available in an apartheid state. And when Amnesty International approached me in Parliament for a meeting, I told them there was no need. I'll do it there and then. I told them what I thought of their report, that I thought they were racist, highly inappropriate with their protest outside the embassy, and they should be thoroughly ashamed. The meeting was over. There was not anything else to say to that. But I think the judicial review is clearly an issue in Israel. It's clearly an issue for Jewish communities across the globe and the wider diaspora. And I don't think the Netanyahu government has struck the right balance yet. I think there are conversations to be had, and to be fair, I think you could probably find a compromise. I'm not sure they're willing to find one. at the moment. But going back to the two-state solution, we need an election in Palestine. President Abbas is 19 years now, I think, into a 4-year term. That's not serious. And we saw his speech just the other day when he was advocating basically for the Nazis and for the wiping out of Israel again. I'm sorry, but you cannot have peaceful, meaningful negotiations when you have someone who fundamentally detests your right to exist.
Absolutely.
One of the,
I've got carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to make one final quick point on that, and I've called it out in the chamber, I've called it out on social media and in several other avenues, but language is very important. And when we hear it from protesters of from a river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what's between the river and the sea? The state of Israel. That song, that chant, is basically perpetuating the ethnic cleansing of Israel. So we need to be incredibly mindful of our language from all sides of this. But chants like that, similar to Roger Waters, there's just no place for it in a modern, tolerant society.
I've just got one more question, but while I'm asking it, if I'm going to then ask everyone if they've got what questions they have, please could you start raising your virtual hands. If you look on your screen, the bottom, the word reaction, if you click on reaction, you will see that there's a line there that says raise hand. If you've got questions, could you please raise your hand? I can see 2 hands up. I've just got one last question of my own. And really, I wanted to just take you back to the two-state solution point. I think that the day is going to come when we're going to start being forced, really, to look at alternatives. You probably know Howard Lee, Lord Lee of Hurley, on the Conservative side of things. He's actually written in the Jewish Chronicle a month or 2 ago now about the need to start seriously considering alternatives to the two-state solution. We shouldn't be so dogmatic about it. There's got to be, we can't just say it's that or nothing. We have to think, well, what alternatives are there that could be could bring some kind of peace? And my own view here is that there seem to be really 2 different attitudes among the Palestinian Arabs. There's the one attitude, which is we want to wipe Israel out completely and all the Jews with it. But then there's also a more sensible attitude, which is we're very jealous of the quality of the lifestyles of the Arabs living west of the Green Line, and we would like more of that for ourselves. The one attitude that's not coming from the Palestinians is a desire to actually have a two-state solution. So therefore, I'm just wondering, are there people in Labour who will start to talk the way Howard Lee is talking about looking at alternatives?
In regards to a specific point of Lord Lee, it's not a conversation I'm aware of being raised either in LFI or outside LFI. But we, again, there are elements of this, and where it's Palestinian Arabs, the Israeli Arabs, deciding where you are on the Western Line or the border. Yes, there are different views. One has more rights than the other. One has greater access to healthcare. But there are, great groups like Save a Child's Heart, as you'll know from the CFI program, who do so much humanitarian work to try and find a soft power solution to this. I have also met now Likud members from the Knesset who have basically purported a one-state solution with ghettos, and that was a CFI dinner which got very silent at the time because no one felt comfortable with where that would go, the optics or basically the element of history repeating itself. But I think what we had, and I was fortunate in 2020, just before COVID, to sit down with Saeed Erekat and being able to have a greater understanding as to what the negotiating position was from the Palestinian side. Unfortunately, if you wanted to know what the negotiating position was 15 years ago, speak to them today. It's not changed, it's not evolved, and it's not pragmatic. what I would have liked to have seen was the Trump deal of the century, and I'm no fan of Trump. Did I expect anyone to agree that? No. Should anyone have agreed to it? No. But hopefully, it could have been the starting of a conversation of, well, actually, we agree with this, but this is wrong and needs changing, and that's the difference between kind of adult dialogue and having a meaningful conversation. Is a two-state solution possible right now? It's possible, but I think the path to it is becoming increasingly narrow. And I think the current government with Netanyahu and the tensions flaring up are to be fair, not helping. But I think the view from the likes of Abbas are fundamentally inflaming it as well. But we have to remember that at Camp David, Yasser Arafat did have something that was agreeable to him. He just couldn't take it back to the Palestinian Authority to get it signed off. So the fact it was turned down, we could have peace right now, but it was turned down by one man back in the 90s. And I know Netanyahu and Arafat had a good working relationship at the time, but we could be in a fundamentally different position if that pen was added to the paper. So I think that there's a lot of history revolved around it. Is there going to be a short-term answer? Unfortunately, no. So I think there's lots of conversations to be had, but until we get both sides around the table, and if that is via proxies, fine. But nothing can be achieved without that meaningful dialogue, and I think we're further away from that at the moment than we have been for a long time.
Okay, I've got two people who've got their hands up, Peter and then Angela. Please, other people, do ask questions. Don't be shy. Click on that reactions button and click on raise your hand, please. Peter.
Thank you, Gary. Hello. Oh, you disappeared, Chris. There you are. I've got three very quick questions, but you might want a pen just to write them down. See. Yep. So, I love what the Labour Party stands for. I also love Israel. However, it makes me really ashamed when you hear MPs spewing out false narratives, when they say Israel have killed children, when the reality is that terror organizations are using child soldiers. And, if there was a 17-year-old person with a machine gun out or an assault rifle outside our houses, we'd want the British Army to step in and resolve that to protect our children. And, there's a lot, MPs might not be saying anything anti-Semitic, but they are certainly encouraging it by, often posting out these false narrative of the stories. And how is the Labour Party going to combat that? The MPs are actually speaking truth or both sides.
Can we get on to the question, Peter, because we've got the others as well.
Yeah, and then the second one is, why are we allowing race organisations to exist like BDS and Al Jazeera, who post them out? And the third one was on your two-state solution that you mentioned. There was the British mandate of Palestine was split into two, some percent given to the Arabs. There is already a two-state solution, and terror organisations have always said we're not interested in this. So I don't understand why that is policy when it's already been resolved, and Israel has given up more land, and all it's resulted in is more terror on civilians, both Jewish and Arabs. So I don't understand why that's our policy when it's already been resolved.
Christian.
Yeah, I will try to go through those in order. Media narrative and narrative by parliamentarians, politicians across the globe is part of the problem. I'm fortunate enough to, for the last couple of years, to have gone and spoken in conferences with the European Jewish Association around most concentration camps. Linked to particular elements. The one that really got me was Theresienstadt, where it's the propaganda coming from particular groups. And I remember what David Miller, with his just racist conspiracy theories at the University of Bristol. Thankfully, that was nipped in the bud, but again, far too late and took far too long. But how many times have we seen on social media pictures of fighter jets supposedly laying fire and laying phosphorus charges in Palestine, when it's ended up being a peaceful reconnaissance mission in Venezuela? So I think there's a lot of people who need to actually learn to fact check or second source their information. But I think the media certainly needs to be a lot more neutral. So I think certainly during the month of hate, we saw how many people had died in an IDF attack on a terror cell. We should be clear, but the IDF is one of the only forces in the world I know who actually ring the destination and say, "Look, you've been firing missiles from there. We are going to bomb you, but you've got an hour to get out." They could quite easily not do that. But the fact they do so is to try and save innocent lives. But we have to call it out for what it is, and it is double war crimes of firing missiles from a hospital, from a school, from news studios, from residential areas. But we need to be much better at calling out both sides, and unfortunately, we can't just rely on the Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish News, etc., to do it. So I think we all have a duty to make sure that a more accurate view is called out on social media. But I don't want my friends in Israel, my constituents who've got family in Israel, ringing family here to ask if they're safe when they're sat in a bomb shelter. It doesn't make sense. In regards to BDS and Al Jazeera, I think we've done quite a lot on Al Jazeera and Russia Today and a lot of just these conspiracies, but there's a lot more to be done when we've got the likes of Chris Williamson still going on with Asa Winstanley and just his racist crank friends. We just need to shut the studios down. Is there a space for actual accurate news from the Middle East to come into a country? Yes. Is there room for talk shows to talk about Palestine declassified? No, it's just conspiracy theories. So I think we need a slightly more nuanced approach, but we absolutely need to stop the tropes, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism being allowed on the airwaves. If it's not appropriate on the streets, it's not appropriate on our TV screens. So we do need to be doing that. As for BDS, I've been calling out for as long as I remember, even when I sat on a pension board. It is nothing other than a racist attack on the state of Israel. So I think we need to be clever with our language. We need to realize that actually it's just a further arm of the Palestinian solidarity campaign aimed at a peaceful, in inverted commas, approach to addressing this. But it's not appropriate. If someone personally doesn't want to buy a product, fine, but it's not for groups to make their own decision against national foreign policy. If you want to change foreign policy, get elected and try to do it that way. But I don't think Palestine is in anyone's top 10 priorities. And for the last one, the two-state solution, we go back to the Balfour Declaration. Whether it's the Yom Kippur War, or things have been very fluid, as we all know in the region. Whilst there are borders, I think they've changed so much. So when we talk about agreeing a Palestinian state, we can't. We don't know what borders, because if there are to be borders, they've got to be secure for both sides. So we can't recognize it now. And whether it's Camp David, I think that's the starting point. You can talk about Oslo, but I think really until we do have everyone around the table, what borders we're talking about is almost a moot point. So I think whilst the dream or the utopia, if you will, of a two-state solution is what we should all aspire to, I sincerely do think we're probably further away than ever for that one.
Thank you. Angela. You're on mute, Angela. Could you?
Okay.
Good.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, one question. It's soon going to be, next Friday, the 29th of September, is going to be the 100th anniversary of the British Mandate legally coming into effect. And I'm not Jewish. I'm actually a Christian who stands firmly with Israel. And I am eternally grateful for the debt that I owe the Jewish people. That I'll stop there. Okay, so our nation was given this tremendous privilege to put into effect the terms of the Balfour Declaration. And we we completely reneged on it. And groups of us have been asking the government, Parliament, if they would please apologise and confess what our nation did. You know, I mean, our military, the administration that was implemented after the San Remo simply blocked Jewish immigration, stood with the Arabs outrageously, started riots to try and drive the Jews out. I don't need to go through it. I'm sure you know all of this. Spurious arguments about Arab claims to the land. And then we stopped Jewish immigration and sent thousands to the Holocaust.
Can we get straight, Angela, can we get straight to a question, please?
Christian, what is the Labour Party position on an apology about the failures of our nation at the time of the mandate?
I'll be honest, I'm not aware of a particular, because obviously if we start having a conversation about that, it's where the borders were drawn for Pakistan and India, and all the complexities around Kashmir as well. Do I think there are things that we would have done differently in hindsight? Yes, I do, and you know, whether it's reading Lily Ebert's autobiography about how she survived Auschwitz and then moved to Israel. There are fundamentally things, whether it was the British Navy or the government insisting, that we look back on and we're wrong. So, you know, is it something that there's a particular policy on? Not that I'm aware of, but from my perspective, it's not something I'd look back on and go, "Oh, I'm proud to be British. We did this." I think there's a lot we can be proud of for our nation's history, but turning people fleeing away from the Holocaust after surviving is not one of those. So I think there's a lot that we can look back on in history and say that was wrong. Is whether or not there's a formal apology on the back of it. But as far as I'm aware, there's not a particular policy either side of the.
I didn't mean a policy. I said an apology.
Okay, Angela, I have to move on. Ruth and
thank
Paul.
you.
Ruth and Paul, I don't know which of you is going to ask a question.
Do you want to ask? Okay. Would a future Labour government proscribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist group?
I really hope so. I mean, there are so many Labour MPs and Conservative MPs, to be fair, who call this out every time we have Foreign Office questions, Home Office questions, any debate on Iran. I've been on record, I think, probably close to 10 times now, calling for the prescription of the IRGC, because let's face it, it's perpetuating terrorism in the Middle East. It's bringing terrorism to the shores of this country. When there's been reports from the JC saying that they are targeting British Jewish residents because of their support for Israel and for their condemnation of Iran, we need to call it out. I mean, in January, supposedly the government was imminent in prescribing it. We're now 8 months on and nothing's happened. Even John McDonnell has called for it to be prescribed. So in terms of a Labour government, you know, we've had so many of our members, including the front bench, saying it needs to be. We just need to get on and do it. You know, for every day we hold off, it just makes our country less secure. So, you know, do I want to see it? Yes. Do I hope to see it? Yes. Do I think it will happen? Yes. It's just when.
Tom Griffiths. You're on mute, Tom.
Yeah, on mute, yeah. Hello, Christian. We've actually met very briefly twice. We've bumped into each other. Once at a community centre residential home within the Jewish community of your constituency, because I've been involved in that for many years, but also once out at a protest outside Manchester Library about local people protesting about abuses going on in a hospital trust in your constituency. And I've got two questions here. One is, what do you think the wider community can learn from the Jewish community and how it treats people in a compassionate and humane way? That's not just in terms of institutions, but in a general way. I think I've learned a great deal from my involvement in that in the past. But secondly, I'm going to bring to you and other people, and I've sent links to Steve, who may not know about it. I'm a trustee for something called Soteria in Britain, very small network, which is bringing humane, compassionate alternatives to people in mental health. And the biggest place with more houses than anywhere else in the world is in Israel. You may not know about it. So I put it in the links to Steve. And I just ask that the next time you go to Israel, you try and visit one of those houses and see what you can learn from them to bring back here. We need more compassion and humanity from the Jewish community and learn from that over here.
I think you make a very good point. I actually remember speaking to you outside the library because it was regarding Edenfield after the Panorama show, and yeah, I think it was probably the Fed that we met at. So I'm quite fortunate to have been attending the Jewish Strategic Group in Greater Manchester basically since it was founded. To the point I really enjoyed over an hour-long conversation about bread just before Pesach. But I now understand the intricacies as to why that was important during COVID. But I think you talk about compassion. It's not just compassion from the Jewish community, although we can take a lot of lessons from the Jewish community. But I think we've stopped being compassionate. We've lost the art to disagree. I would say we've lost the art to agree. When you're arguing over who cares more about a particular issue, that's not a good position to be in. But in regards to the Fed, especially during COVID, and even more so now, my very first visit as a member of Parliament was to the Fed. And other than being surprised by the lack of diversity with meeting 3 white men all called Mark, it's how social care should be. And the fact that they have to raise the best part of £2 million a year, and arguably more now because of inflation, but they're able to do so because of the generosity, the kindness, and the compassion of the community. That shows that actually that's the model to try and replicate. Now, should charity be involved in social care? No, but the fact that there are times when it's worked and it's worked well, that's what we need to do. But whether it's L'Chaim Food Bank, that's basically funded by one local businessman wanting to invest back into the community that's given him so much. The Jewish Community Awards, just 10 days ago, I was humbled to see the very best of the Manchester community. And I know we do things differently in Manchester, but actually the commitment, the dedication, the generosity from all sections is something we need to celebrate. And it's not just celebrate once a year at an awards ceremony, it's celebrate every single day to make sure more and more people are getting parts. I think when David Cameron talked about the big society, we saw that during the COVID pandemic. It's what we do to actually maintain that level of people wanting to volunteer, wanting to get involved in their shul, their care home, just actually looking after your neighbor. There are so many things, and all of these to me are intrinsic in the Jewish community. I mean, if one person is harmed, it's like harming all of mankind. There are so many things that can be done that just aren't, but they are in the Jewish community. And I was saying at the awards that I'm incredibly proud to represent one of the largest Jewish communities in the country. But to be fair, they make it easy. There's so much fantastic work in the community that I get to highlight so many different organizations and praise them, but they don't do it for praise. They do it just because it's the right thing. So if there's one thing we can do, it's just to highlight all that work that's being undertaken. And the number of times people have said to me is, all right, Christian, we get it, you're Jewish, you don't need to bang on about it. I do have to tell people to say that to themselves a bit more slowly and think about what they're saying. But we do need to bang on about it, because if we don't, no one knows about it. So that's what we need to do. And I think everyone on this call, anyone involved in any community organisation, that onus is on us.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions, and also I've got a couple of questions from the chat. So probably another 10 minutes or so. Felix, then Steve. Felix, Mara.
Okay. Well, thank you, Christian. These problems in Israel we've been speaking about have been dragging on for quite a long time now. For me, I think it's unconscionable that a state that was meant to be self-determining is denied its right to exist by so many in the international community. Do you think we should be talking about timescales to to sort out these problems. One thing we spoke about was, is the two-state model, is that the way forward? Should we look at something else? But do you think we need to talk about timescales? Because I don't know how Israelis can be expected to live in this. They manage, they're very good at it, but I just think we need to talk about timescales.
Christian.
Or is it too dangerous?
I think if we talk about timescales, that might actually inflame the situation even so. But in terms of what you were saying about the international community, there were so many times when, and again, Amnesty International, a prime example, where they turn around and go, well, but the UN have said this. Is what, has the UN said that? Or is the UN Human Rights Council? Because the two are very fundamentally different. But when you look at the UN Human Rights Council, pretty much the majority of their meetings are basically to issue more censures towards Israel. It's, well, what about Russia, who's literally, gone for a war with Ukraine? What about China and Xinjiang? What about Iran? What about any other country? No, it's Israel, Israel, Israel. So I think there's a wider conversation as to, are some of these international bodies fit for purpose? They've served a very important role, but is that role still relevant now, or do we need to have a wider kind of remit of how do we make it fit for the 21st century, and actually highlighting where there are concerns, not just where there are particular concerns from individual member states. So I think we need to look at that, including the ICC, who are looking at Israel, but only recently now starting for Russia. But I think they need to widen their remit, but make it much more specific, as opposed to just the UN Human Rights Council want you to do this, and it's just another censorship motion. But things like the Darfur the conference shouldn't have any place in society. When you've got Iran hosting Holocaust cartoon competitions, this is not fit for any kind of adult conversation other than inflaming an international, not conflict, but contentious area. So I think we need to call it out, but I think from a Foreign Office perspective, we need to be shouting loudly that actually some of these things aren't right. As one of the founding members, we need to be saying, well, this is how it should be. And when we have a chair for the Security Council or any of the other bodies, I think we need to use that meaningfully, rather than just say, well, the status quo is this, let's crack on as we always have done. So if I had £1 for every time I've heard this is how we've always done it, I'd be a very rich man. And I'm sick of hearing that phrase. It doesn't actually achieve anything. So I think we need to be much more innovative about how we find some of these solutions. But I think at the moment, we're not solving anything. If anything, we're just inflaming a situation which is already very problematic.
Steve Waldman.
Okay, I joined the Jewish Labour Group and the Labour Party last year, but I actually suspended my membership when, at a Zoom meeting of the Jewish Labour Group about immigration to the UK of people from Arab or Muslim lands, I said I was torn between feeling immigration should not be restricted, as it was in 1945, 1948, by the British to Palestine for the Jews, but aware that most immigrants from Muslim lands will be almost all anti-Jewish and anti-Israel. My dilemma was not addressed at all. It seemed to be too contentious. And the Labour Party resignation related to Keir Starmer's statement, which we have partly discussed, of the two-state solution. It just seems to be a totally implausible possibility with Mohammed Abbas or anybody who replaces him, and with Hamas. I also found various disparaging statements by people such as were streeting about Israeli actions, which made me stop following him on Twitter. I wonder if you'd comment on any of these points.
Christian.
I think the two-state solution is still the aspiration, and I think it has to be. Like I've said numerous times throughout this call, I think we're further away from it as we ever have been. The government's position is we will recognise a Palestinian state when it's most likely to achieve the end goal of peace. I think if we were to do that today, we wouldn't have peace. So there's no point even discussing that element. right now because it's not going to achieve anything. In regards of those seeking immigration, I myself have gone on record, actually apologising for some of my previous statements, because I think there are those seeking genuine refuge who we absolutely have to support. My family heritage is Ukrainian. I still have family there now. So to see what they're going through on a daily basis, it's absolutely right that we stood up as a country and said, no, we will support you. But where is that support for Afghanistan? Where is that support for citizens literally being murdered on the streets by the morality police in Iran? Where is it for Syria, for Yemen? All these international conflict areas where they are literally being murdered by their own tyrannical regimes. It doesn't seem to be there. So I think we need to be much more open for proper immigration, for those seeking an amnesty, but seeking refuge, more importantly. When people say we're a kind, compassionate nation, show it. But we have to do so properly. In regards to, I don't know which comments you're referring to from where, so I might need to educate myself on those particular ones. But I think there are a few things the Israeli government, and in particular Ben-Gvir, has done that I'm not happy about. When he was on Temple Mount with the police, etc., that was always going to inflame tensions, and I think you can have legitimate criticism about that, but again, there's a very fine line between legitimate criticism about a policy and approach before it spills over into anti-Zionism. And Wes isn't an anti-Zionist. When I was first elected, we were both the co-chair for the APPG for British Jews. So I think there's a lot of work he's done, and rightfully so. And when I've taken him around the Fed, he's proud of what he's seen and wants to replicate it. When he went to Israel and saw MDA and the technology they're using, he wants to replicate that. So I think there's a lot of things we can learn from Israel. But I think we just need to have an adult conversation about it. And it can't just be this entrenched of Israel bad, Palestine good, which a lot of people want to stick to. So it's not right, it's not accurate, and it doesn't actually achieve anything. So I know I've said it a few times, but until we do have these conversations, and we should be leading from the front on this. When the Abraham Accord started, fantastic as they are, Britain wasn't even in the room, let alone at the table for any of these conversations. For all the relationships we've got in the Middle East, from all of our history, we could have been doing a lot of the introductions and leading this conversation. So this could have been achieved a lot earlier. I got the feeling there was a lot of the Arab world becoming tired with Palestine and wanting to drag them forward. I think the actions of the last year have stalled some of that progress, but I'd like to think that it's not stalled forever. So I do think we can progress further, but I think we need to be using our diplomatic relationships in the Middle East, Northern Africa countries to say, well, which more countries can we bring to the table to just say, actually, Israel relations are normalized, they are peaceful, and there's so much to achieve from it, whether it's trade, whether it's humanitarian help, whether it's technology. There's a lot you can achieve by actually just having these adult conversations, and we need to start now.
Okay, can I move now to a couple of questions in the chat, which is essentially the same question. It's almost a yes/no question.
Our politicians can't answer yes/no questions, Gary.
Well, see what you can do with this one. If Labour gets into government, is it immediately going to recognise the Palestinians?
No.
Good. Okay, there's a yes/no question, thank you. So I've got now one more question. Keith Rowe, our Vice Chairman, and then I'm going to ask Steve Winston, our Managing Director, to propose a vote of thanks. Keith.
Thank you. Good evening, Christian. I'd like to start by just thanking you for a lot of the good work that you've done since you got elected to the House of Commons, particularly on behalf of the Jewish community. But you're in the House of Commons by virtue of the fact that you were wearing a blue Conservative rosette at the time, and had you worn a red Labour rosette at the time, you almost certainly wouldn't have got elected. So I'd just like to ask you, in the interests of democracy, do you not think it's right that if you're elected by virtue of the fact that you were a member of the Conservative Party, that really, when you changed over and thought that your allegiance should lie with the Labour Party, that you should have given your constituents the chance to actually have a vote on that and see if they still want you as their representative?
So, thanks, Kate. I've gone on record with this one quite a few times, and I wasn't just elected to represent Conservative voters. I was elected to represent the entire community, and I've had a number, and I'm talking hundreds of residents who I've spoken to, thanking me, and when I've gone door knocking, even giving me the occasional hug. Not too many, so we don't talk about it, but it's been a very warm reception there, where some I think it's standing up for what they see. Others, particularly from the Jewish community, saw it as a sign that it was welcome to return. I think it's safe to say that during the general election, the Jewish community, perhaps for the first ever, perhaps the only time, we'll see what happens in the next election, was a block vote because of what it meant to have a Jeremy Corbyn government. I've had rabbis, community leaders, communal organisation leaders contact me and say, "Thank you, we're coming across with you, and we're taking up our membership of the party again." Do I think there should be about? In short, at the moment, no. If I was to resign tomorrow, it wouldn't be the Labour Party who choose to move the writ. It would be the Conservative Party. And considering what I crossed for in January of last year, so that's 20 months ago, they've not selected a candidate. They've not sought to have any meaningful engagement with the constituency. In fact, they've lost councillors, and the popular vote in Bury South has been overwhelmingly Labour for the last two local elections. But the main thing was, if I resign tomorrow to trigger a by-election, that could potentially be 3 or 4 months without any representation whatsoever for the constituents during a cost of living crisis, which ultimately got worse throughout the year, whether it was due to the mini budget, fuel prices going up, core inflation, and CPI, RPI, or kosher price index as well going through the roof. I think people need help. So to actually deprive them of that representation for the sake of my indulgence didn't seem fair either. So I'd much rather represent them. If they don't want me, then they will have a say within probably the next 9 months or so. I hope to be re-elected. I am standing with my red rosette and have been campaigning other than when I've had my crutches in recent months. And I'm hoping to pass that message across there, especially to the new ward I'm taking for Kersal and Broughton Park. So I'm hopeful to be re-elected. If not, then that's for the people saying, actually, we thought you were wrong with that. But I think what we've seen since, what I've heard since speaking to people on a very regular basis, I'm not just knocking on doors, whether it's in the local pub, actual people overwhelmingly are supportive.
Thank you. That concludes the questions. So in a minute, I'm going to ask Steve Winston, our Managing Director, to propose a vote of thanks. First, I just want to advise you of meetings in October. We've got 3 events happening in October. The first of these will all be circulated to all our members by the office, so you don't have to remember everything I'm saying. Wednesday, 18th of October, we have a representative of the Israel Defence Forces coming to speak. There'll be a face-to-face meeting in London. On the 25th of October, we have a lobby day of Parliament, which Steve is organising, and he will say a few words about it. And then we have a very interesting event on Monday, the 30th of October. It's an annual lecture, which will be at Lauderdale Road, the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, which will be in honour of Leslie Hall-Belisha. Who is Leslie Hall-Belisha? I hear some of you say he was the inventor of the Belisha beacon. But more importantly, of Zebra Crossings, more importantly, he was a Jewish cabinet minister in the war just before the Second World War. And he was prominent for 3 reasons. Number 1, he was an Orthodox Jew. Number 2, he faced massive anti-Semitism, and indeed he was forced out of the cabinet by Neville Chamberlain in January 1940 because senior Conservatives wanted to do a deal with Hitler and they couldn't have a Jew at the War Office. Number three, he was heavily involved in early Israel in the early 1950s, advocating that the West take control of the Suez Canal away from Nasser, which, as many of us will know, led to the 1956 crisis. The lecture will be delivered by Jane Wallace-Simons, who is the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, some of you will have heard of, who's also written a book called Israelophobia. So that will be an event well worth going to at Lauderdale Road on the 30th of October. Steve.
Thank you, Gary. So before I offer a vote of thanks to Christian, Gary mentioned our lobby day, which is being held on Wednesday, the 25th of October. It will be, the day consists of two parts. We will have a morning briefing in a venue which is literally a stone's throw from Parliament. And then the afternoon briefing, which during which we will have a variety of MPs come to address us on the issues. That will be in Portcullis House. Now, the topic of the lobby day is lobbying our MPs to support the anti-BDS bill. For those of you who are following it, there are some amendments being proposed, some of which are acceptable, some of which seek to weaken the bill, especially with regard to Israel. And, you know, I'm sure we can all realise what some of the motives behind those. So that's on Wednesday, the 25th of October. Christian, thank you on behalf of the NJA. Thank you so much for giving up your time. Better late than never, because we were meant to host you, I think, back in July, and you had problems with your leg. And it's good to hear what you said earlier, that you're now sort of learning to walk again. So may you, please God, go from strength to strength in that regard. You've faced some quite tough questions this evening, and I have to say you've answered them all very, 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 very well, giving a very heartfelt response when needed. I think it's, you know, for many of us, we do feel that, you know, the writing is on the wall, perhaps, that in the next elections, Labour will get in. And I certainly find the notion of a Labour Party with MPs such as yourself more comforting than what I felt in 2019. And it's good to know that your stance on Israel has remained consistent throughout. From when you were a Tory MP and now a Labour MP. You haven't wavered. Your support is very much appreciated. And just, yeah, on behalf of us all, thank you for joining us and giving us your insights.
Thank you, Christian. It's been a great pleasure having you.
Thank you
very much.
Toda.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Have an enjoyable rest of the evening. Bye-bye.